Now, you can see that right now we're on the Virtual Desktop web page. This is through CUNY, and it's an important point to remember here. This isn't a John Jay program. This is a CUNY program, which means when it comes time to log into the system, you're not going to be using your John Jay ID. You're going to be using your CUNY ID. Now, right away, you can see that there's buttons here for ArcGIS, SPSS, and a series of other software programs. The only one we're really worried about for this presentation is going to be SPSS. Now, before you click the button, because if you do right now and you haven't done anything else, you're just going to get an error message, or in some cases, absolutely nothing's going to happen because the program doesn't know what to do with the command it's getting. On the other hand, what you should really start off with over here on the left-hand side is the Virtual Desktop installation page. And what you're going to do is going down this list is you're going to install one of these clients onto your computer. Now you're going to see there's installation instructions for each of the different operating systems. I use Windows here, so I'm just going to click through on that. And you can see that there's a series of instructions to follow. Now, when I installed this software on my computer, it actually didn't really require me to go through many of these steps. It just installed it, and then more importantly, it required that I restart the computer. So be prepared for that because it can be a little bit time consuming. But the one other thing I want to highlight here is that you can see point number 3. Your CUNY first ID followed by your login at login.cuny.edu. Again, don't try and use your John Jay email here. If you do, you're just going to get an error message and it's going to be a big old waste of your time. So let's go back now. I've already installed the client software. I decided not to make that part of the video because it took about 3 or 4 minutes to run, and that didn't seem to be something that was going to be very interesting for anyone to watch. So once that's installed, I'm simply going, and I've restarted my computer, I'm simply going to click the SPSS button here. And you can see I get a pop-up. Yours could be a little bit different, but the same message should apply. Does the program have permission to open up that client software? And I click the open button because obviously the whole point of this is to get into that software. Now, I'm also being prompted now for my CUNY login information. And again, remember, if you just try and use your John Jay, you're going to get an error message here. And this can take a little bit of time. And in fact, apparently, only because I'm recording, am I going to realize that I must have entered my password wrong. Let's try that again. There we go. My apologies. So what you see happening is a virtual desktop is being created. Now, there's a couple things to highlight out of this, but the main thing I want you to remember is that your virtual desktop and your desktop on your computer normally are not connected here. And you're going to see the virtual desktop runs a lot slower than things do normally on your computer, so you should be prepared for that. But otherwise, it looks like sort of a traditional blank kind of screen. Now, there's not a lot of things that I want to focus in on here, but there's just a couple. So the first is, if you go over down here to where the Start button is, and of course for Mac users and other software, it's going to be a little bit different here. But if you go down to where your list of your programs is, you're going to see that you get a lot of those sort of free software programs that you normally get with access to the computer labs through CUNY. And then maybe most importantly, for our purposes, you can see we have Ibm Spss Statistics 25. Now, for mine, it actually is already in starting up SPSS because, of course, that was the main reason for using the virtual desktop. And you might not be able to see, but in the bottom, I'm getting the little SPSS logo as it begins to install. Now, the important thing to note here is when you look at the list of those programs, nothing on there are the programs that you probably have installed on your computer. Now, if you have Office, then obviously Office is showing up in both, but that's not your Office. That's Office off the virtual desktop. And what that means is that these programs that you have access to through the virtual desktop, they're being run remotely. Now, that means they're going to run slower. And most importantly, and you can see here we've got the pop-up screen for SPSS. I'm just going to close the welcome. But the bigger issue here, the most important thing to remember is that particularly when you have something like SPSS, is that the only data it initially will have access to is data on the virtual desktop, which of course there isn't any because everyone has access to the virtual desktop. So I just want to show you a couple of things here that are going to try and make this process a little bit easier for you to work with. Okay, so picking up where we just were, and I apologize, I sort of stopped and reset something so it would be a little bit easier for us to see since you haven't had an opportunity to experience it. What we have now is we have the program SPSS open. And what I've done is I've gone back and I've cleaned out the cache on this so I can do something for the first time so you can see what it's like. Now, if I go to File, Open, Data, what you're going to see is, of course, that all of the connections, all of the places I can look for files here, they're all part of the virtual network. In other words, if I have the data on my desktop, which I do, the data I want to use, and let me sort of demonstrate that here really quickly. I'm going to minimize these guys. On my desktop here, I have a folder called CJBA240, and in it, I have a single data file, which is my data file that I want to have access to in SPSS. Now, on my virtual folder, on my virtual desktop, I only have access to virtual folders, and the data is not actually in there. But I can tell the program where to look to allow me, even through the virtual desktop, to find the files I want. And what I'm going to do is under Options, I'm going to go to Share Folders. And you're going to see the default here is the sharing option. And over here on the right-hand side, I'm going to simply click Add. And then the add, it's not part of the virtual network or your virtual desktop. It's actually looking on the network drive on your computer. So if I click on Desktop here, you can see all the folders that are on my desktop of my personal computer. And maybe most importantly, there's CJBA240. I'm going to say OK. And now that has become a place that I can look for my data. And I'm simply going to say OK. Now, by the way, I'm going to back up for a second and just show you one other thing here. Under Options, Share Folders, if I wanted to be able to have access to pretty much everything on my network drive, I could also just click this little function here that says Share Your Local Folders, local files, excuse me, and say OK. Now, the reason this becomes helpful is now if I go down to Start and to Computer, you're going to see on my list of networks, I actually have two. I have one, the hard drive of my computer, and I also have that folder I selected before. Now, if I double click into that, lo and behold, I have access to the files there. Now, I have a couple options at this point. One is I can just try and copy it right over into my virtual desktop. And in this case, I simply clicked on it and dragged it over. And once I've done that, just like I would as if it had been on my hard drive, I can say File, Open, Data. This time I'm going to tell it because I've copied this over to the desktop. And there's my file. And if I click Open on that, oops, there we go. Sorry, again, I forget sometimes I have to be patient. But there you go. And now you have access to the data. Now, I've told you before that this is a bit of a slower process. On the other hand, it means that any place that you've got a pretty good network connection, you can access your files. Again, you need to take a little bit of extra time to prepare, again, installing the client software, recognizing the software is going to run a lot slower. And more importantly, you do have to remember that if you're inactive for 20 minutes, the computer's going to forget everything. Which means if you're working on something, you want to try and make sure that you're backing it up to your hard drive and not relying on the virtual network, because at some point it's going to disconnect and it's going to forget everything that you've been doing. All right, that is all I wanted to demonstrate here because everything else is just going to be using SPSS. I hope you found this helpful, and as always, I hope you have a great day.